Hello and welcome everyone to my first kind of intentionally recorded lesson or class, whatever you want to call it, on Black labor in the US. And this is an adaptation of the presentation that I gave at my college, the college that I work at, Parkland College in Champaign, Illinois. And I gave a presentation for Black History Month on Black labor statistics, on labor statistics in general, but centering Black labor and immigrant labor. And so this presentation is an adaptation of that, where I just added a few pieces of information. So I'm excited to do this, and let's get started. I want to just mention a few disclaimers. The sources for my presentation are listed on the last few slides of this PowerPoint, which is obviously posted on Facebook, on YouTube. And I'll also reference the sources as I'm going through particular slides if that's relevant. I do think that the sources that I've pulled are very reliable. They come from the US Labor Statistics Bureau and community and population surveys mostly, and just major national surveys and databases. But these are statistics, and so that means that these are generalizations. Not everything applies to every person that's placed in a group. And so we want to keep that in mind. Even though this is probably some of the more reliable statistics and data that exist, there's always, generalizations in data. I will also highlight areas in which questions arose about numbers and where there's a need for further investigation. Okay, so let's get started. All right, so these are the various sections I will cover in this presentation. Capitalism and slavery, kind of starting with the primary contradiction. And then we'll talk about Black jobs. What are Black jobs? Who's taking them? We'll talk about immigrant and foreign-born workers, and I'll discuss some of the language around distinguishing between these two collectives, conclusion, takeaways, and utilization of this material, and then how to contact me if you have additional questions or other inquiries. Okay, so first, it's really important for us to begin with the system, the economic system that exists in the United States, and that is a capitalist economic system. We also refer to this economic system, or economic systems in general, that exist across various societies as the means of production. And this means of production is really important for shaping the overall culture of a society, even how a society is organized and what people do for a living, what they do in their leisure time, etc. So in a capitalist society, there are different types of economic models, right? We have capitalism, we have which is, the US is a great example of that. Many European countries are great examples of that. We have socialist economic systems, which exist in places like Cuba and Vietnam, which are being experimented and practiced and developed across various countries on the continent of Africa. Some really fantastic things have happened and are happening in Zimbabwe. And then the Sahel states, some really great, I believe to be socialist development and revolutionary organization taking place. And what is also important to note is that most countries have a mixed economy where there's blends of socialist dimensions and capitalist dimensions, right? And maybe some authoritarian and totalitarian dimensions, right? And we can see some of those things in the US. But in the US, the capitalist system is dominant, even though I think there are also aspects of socialism. We talk about public taxes and public services and things like that. But with the capitalist system, there is the requirement of having a hierarchy, of owners. The bourgeoisie is what Karl Marx called them, which I can go ahead and move on to the next slide. These are the owners, the property owners, the business owners, the capitalists. And then you have the workers, the people that work for them. And Karl Marx and Frederick Engels referred to those folks as the proletariats. Let me move my image out of the way so y'all can see the slide. So, since a capitalist economic model is based on individual accumulation of wealth, not collective, what's happened over time is that individuals and racialized groups that have been placed at the top of the hierarchy, white people, for example, they have um, been able to occupy those higher tiers, more so than other groups. And other racialized minorities or ethnic groups have populated the proletariat or just the general worker population more so. So you need that base of a lot of masses of just workers, laborers, right? Who are also not getting paid living wages. Because if you paid all of these workers, we're talking about in the US, we're talking about millions of workers, right? We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people in the workforce, at different periods of time throughout a given year. And so if you paid all of those people a living wage, it will be very difficult for that owner, for that capitalist to become rich and sustain that richness, that wealth over a long period of time. And so what has happened is that these owners, these CEOs, these company owners, business owners, leads of corporations, whatever, have decided to cap wages essentially. And so once the workers are producing a product, investing their labor, right? They're being paid for their labor. Their wages is payment for that labor. But there's a surplus that's been created over time. And so it may only take 6 or 8 hours, right, to do the thing that's needed to produce what you need to produce on your job. But work hours have been extended because of the desire for more production, right? And more profit for these owners and these bourgeoisie. Then you have folks who are not making a living wage as the dominant bulk of the workforce, right? Because if they did, then the owners would not be wealthy. And so once that product leaves the factory, or once your role as the worker is completed in the development of that product, you don't benefit anymore from that. Once your investment in labor is completed, all of the benefits and profit from that point on go toward the capitalists, the owners. And think about that. And so as the slide says here, labor value is the amount of value workers produce through labor. Surplus plus value flows only in the direction of capitalists. Okay? And so I'll read through this slide a little bit here and kind of summate this, and we'll move on. Karl Marx's concept of surplus value provides scientific evidence for the exploitive nature of capitalism. This is a systemic practice that capitalists have developed to make this so. Where they will continuously get rich and benefit in their sleep. They're making money, and the general worker wages are remaining stagnant. Surplus value is the extra profit that capitalists earn by paying workers less than the full value of their labor. As I said, longer work hours, but part of that time is the surplus value, right? And capitalists are profiting from the product after it's left the worker's hands, or after that initial investment is concluded. Then it's the capitalists that are benefiting at that point. So this is an exploitive system. Capitalism is an exploitive system foundationally, and especially in the way that it's been enacted and carried out in the West, and in the United States in particular. And we also have to keep in mind the connection to slavery, right? And the ways in which it was the Atlantic slave trade and the exportation of Africans from the continent of Africa to the Americas, and all of the profits that was generated over these decades of slavery, these centuries of slavery. That is where capitalist development really bloomed, right? There wasn't capitalism in the way that we understand it prior to that. Slavery was the basis of that capitalist development. And there's a book by Eric Williams called Capitalism and Slavery that goes through this history. And there are many other books that you can read, and many of Karl Marx's works that talk about this. But Africans were brought to the United States to work for free. Okay, they were never considered workers in any general sense, right? They never had any term limits or benefits or wages. They were forcibly brought here to work for free. So it was never intended for Africans in America, in the Americas, in the United States, to be paid laborers in the first place. And I'm pausing intentionally for us to sit with that for a second. Okay, then we can move on now. So in conclusion, low-wage workers, which again tend to be the majority of non-white workers, right? Especially, well, yeah, those that are most active in the workplace. So low-wage workers tend to work the longest hours and have the most non-standard work hours. So we're talking about folks working outside of 9 to 5 hours, folks that are working 2, 3 in the morning, the graveyard shift, working really late into the evening. Those types of work are becoming more and more common, and especially for certain categories of people, particularly low-wage laborers, who are usually working multiple jobs, which we'll get to in a second. The most productive and essential workers in the labor force are these low-wage laborers, right? This was highlighted during the peak of COVID, that our essential workers are actually the ones that we value the least in our society, that we pay the least, and that we generally disregard until there are moments of crises. So most do not earn living wages and they work multiple jobs. They also face significant restrictions on social safety net benefits. And so if you think about the requirements for, I don't know if TANF still exists, but I'm thinking about like food stamps or other sort of welfare, social welfare benefits, there are mandates for work hours, longevity on the job, and all these things in order to get those benefits. And so these complications and this instability of work for these low-wage laborers in particular is also disadvantaging them when it comes to any other social safety net opportunities that may be available to them. So the title of this talk, this phrase "Black jobs," came from a statement made by Donald Trump, even though I feel like this was made by other folks before. But it's gotten a lot of attention since Donald Trump mentioned this. I forget the forum now, but I can share that later on. You can just do a Google search and you find it. But I pulled a snippet of Trump's comment on this. And then I also pulled a comment from Steve Bannon, who was the political strategist in the first Trump administration. Both of them are referring to either Black jobs or immigrant laborers. So we have Donald Trump saying the millions of people that Joe Biden is referring to, allowed to come in through the border. They're taking Black jobs now. They're taking Black jobs and they're taking Hispanic jobs. So that is a point of confusion, which always tends to arise with things that Donald Trump says, because on one end, he's trying to deport all Hispanics, or especially folks from Mexico and South America or Latin America. But at the same time, he's saying that some other group is taking even their jobs. So we'll revisit that later on and try to come to some clarity around that. And then we have Steve Bannon, the workers that are here on the H-1B visas, which if you guys aren't familiar with this, you all aren't familiar with this visa, it's been in the news recently quite a bit, so you can find a lot of information online, but this is a work visa for folks coming from different countries. And there was recently a stir up with Vivek Ramoussi, I can't pronounce his last name, but he was the co-head of this new Dodge program that Elon Musk is heading, and some other folks. And he was fired from that program. Apparently, he was really working to provide these visas for folks, for workers coming from India. And I believe he's of Indian descent. So anyway, that's the H-1B visas. Should be deported. At the same time, we're deporting the 15 million illegal aliens Biden brought across the border to suppress wages to low-income workers. Okay, so I think we get what is being said here, that it is immigration, but namely the illegal immigrants that are coming here, across the border, which, the border that we talk about most in US media, that's talked about most in US media, is the Mexican border. And so we need to work through this and debunk the lies inherent in these comments. So let's talk about Black jobs. What are Black jobs? There are Black jobs if you think about it, in that, what are jobs that most Black people tend to have. Then there are patterns there, right? And there are also patterns when we look at other ethnic groups, like even, white folks and Asian and Latino folks. We also see patterns in employment. And we see a lot of patterns by racial ethnic groups, because these are things that have been socially constructed and developed over time. They're not natural patterns. They're patterns that have come about through systemic injustices, namely, and systemic practices, right? And cultural practices that have made these distinctions between these racial ethnic groups. All right, so the most common fields of employment for Black or African workers in the US are service work. Okay, and service work is a broad umbrella. If you think of service, that can include a lot of different types of work. I'm a professor. That's a type of service, in my opinion. Being a doctor is a type of service. Being a counselor, working at the post office, like all of these things are service work. But there are categories under that umbrella that offer some areas of distinction, and where you can kind of highlight particular areas that have high concentrations of Black workers. Okay, and so the federal workers, there's been a lot of conversation around federal workers because of the things happening with this current administration. Black workers do make up a significant amount of federal workers, but they're more highly concentrated in other areas of service work, actually. So we'll get into some dimensions of this right now. So when we look at service work, we have 17.6% of Black workers employed in this realm of occupation. Within that, we have community and social service occupations, where 19.1% of Black workers are employed. There's also some gender distinctions here, where women are much more heavily employed in this area than men. Okay. And then we have the number for federal workers here, 18%. Okay, so that's less than the workers that are within the community and social service occupations. So if we look at federal workers, the top two professions are medical, hospital, dental, and public health. And then we have general admin and clerical service, 15% and 15.5%. So very comparable there. Black workers account for about 19% of all federal workers. Top occupations of 2023 included nurses, medical support assistants, compliance, inspection, and support, and contact representatives. There's something else I wanted to add here. And I think the next piece actually speaks to this, that Black workers are over concentrated in low-paying federal jobs, right? Like general admin, clerical service, postal work. And these are referred to as the GS2 positions, and they range from GS2 to GS6 level. These grade levels typically comprise lower and entry-level administrative positions. So yes, it sounds very prestigious that Black workers are employed in the federal government. But again, when we look under the surface a little bit more closely, we see that they're also employed in low-wage laborers, even within the federal government. Albeit they probably have some, halfway decent benefits, and maybe more so than some other worker categories, maybe some additional job stability and things that may come along with that type of work. But this is still the case. Okay. So let's look at age, and then we'll take a peek at gender as far as Black workers. The Black youth employment rate is consistently lower than other youth employment rates. And so when we look at other racial ethnic categories for youth, those 16 to 24, I believe, is the range for youth. We see that Black youth are underrepresented, underemployed. Prime age employees, which are those between the ages of 24 and 54, have an unemployment rate of 5.2% for Black workers. And this may seem low, but it's much higher than other workers, other ethnic groups of workers. And at the same time, it's the lowest that it's been since 1973. So we're starting to see, as we're going through this data, we're also starting to see some longitudinal patterns. And when we get to the conclusion of this presentation, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, because there is a pretty clear pattern that's existed for Black workers, and that has been low wage employment, inconsistent employment, and yeah, just kind of high unemployment rates over a very significant period of time. I mean, we're talking about 60, 70 years. We can trace these patterns. Okay, so gender. Wages have increased for Black women and men workers since 2014, but at a very slow rate. And so as I was looking through these changes in wages from 2003, 2008, 2012, 2016, all these different years, and looking at the rate of change, I mean, sometimes it'd be like a $200 increase, from year to year, or then maybe after 4 years, it'd be a $400 increase. Not big jumps. And I did see some patterns by time period, which made me think, as a sociologist, I was thinking about who was president during that time, what major social conflicts were going on during that time, and other things that may have shaped labor and employment, which all those things obviously shape labor and employment as well. And there definitely seemed to be an employment impact for Black workers actually during Trump's first presidency, where there was a downward trend in wages. So there's some interesting things that you can note when you dive more deeply into that. Black women have more parity to Black men in wages. And so we know that there is a race-gender pay gap where women make less money than men in the United States overall. But when we look at women of a certain ethnic group in relation to men of that same ethnic groups, we also see a disparity. And it's greatest among, I believe, white women and men. And then it becomes closer when we look at other ethnic groups. And so with Black women and men, it could be something like 96 cents to a man's dollar, 98 cents to a man's dollar, where it may be 86 cents to a man's dollar for white women. So there's more parity between Black men and Black women workers, because generally they're all making low wages, right? But Black women do have higher levels of education and are showing up in greater numbers in some of these professional positions, higher paying positions of authority. Black women workers are really showing up there. Black workers hold multiple jobs more than any other ethnic group. For most people, their primary job is full-time and their secondary job is part-time. And I think there was something else I wanted to say about that. The third most common category of multiple job holders are folks who have 2 part-time jobs. So that was the third most common category. Okay. All right, so we're going to transition into Black worker views and experiences. And this came, I believe this was from a Pew Research survey of Black workers over a span of years. And that source is linked on the last slides. So looking at bias and discrimination, Black workers are most likely to say they've experienced discrimination at work because of their race and ethnicity. Okay. So Black workers are more likely to name that it is being Black, being classified as Black, that has directly led to the discrimination they face at work. A quarter of US workers say that being Black makes it harder to succeed where they work. And this is not just Black workers, this is a quarter of US workers in general across all racial ethnic categories. So even white workers, Asian workers, like Latino workers, etc., Arab workers, they all say that being Black makes it harder to succeed. So we have other ethnic groups of workers also admitting that being a Black worker makes it more difficult for you to succeed at work. Wow, right? Majorities of Black workers across occupational categories see racial and ethnic bias as a major problem in hiring and performance evaluations in general. And those performance evaluations are important, right? They lead to promotions, tenure, higher wages, and more power and autonomy and authority on your job. And so Black workers are reporting that their racial identity, their racial ethnic identity is producing bias and discrimination and even their evaluations of their work on their jobs. When it comes to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, Black workers especially value diversity in the workplace, but a sizable share give their employer low marks in this area. I bet some of those workers are giving some employers even lower marks and now that they've canceled their programs that they started in 2020. Not that there was ever that much investment in these types of programs or that they were ever that fruitful for Black workers, let's be honest. These programs were most beneficial for white women and workers who identify as LGBTQ+, but generally even in that they were white. So we definitely, in my personal opinion, I think we should have these programs and many more until there's actually some balance and justice in our society. But we also have to be honest about the impact, the material impact that these policies and practices are having on workers, and they haven't shifted much at all for Black workers. So you can keep your DEI. So the average Black worker in the United States is a Black woman, 24 to 54 years old, likely working in a service position, but especially likely to be working in community and social service occupations, with a median weekly income of $978. That is the average Black worker in the United States. All right, I'm gonna take a sip of water, and then we're going to get into immigrant and foreign-born workers. All right. So foreign-born workers do have higher labor force participation than native-born workers in the United States. It's true. It's a slight difference, 66% versus 61%, but it's still a difference. And I do think that it's interesting sociologically. I do wonder, and this is one of those things, if folks want to do some further investigation, I do wonder if you would see this sort of pattern or fact, statistic in other countries that are comparable to the US economically, like other Western countries in Europe or something, for example. Because I actually think that this is kind of unique for especially a country of the stature, economic and political stature of the US, to have a workforce that is made up of predominantly foreign-born workers. I think is interesting. I'm not placing a value judgment on that. I think it's an interesting phenomenon that's worth exploring. So this is the case. But we also should distinguish between, immigrant and foreign-born workers, which is what we're doing here. They're not the same people. So immigrant workers can be born in the US, right? And so I'm thinking about if we use Mexican identifying folks as an example, being someone that would fall under like the DACA category, having a parent that came to the US and had a child here that was you, and then you became a US citizen in that way, right? And then there's also like, your dad who is still in Mexico comes to temporarily work in the US, or maybe just comes over and finds a job in the US without going through the immigration process. And so you can have an immigrant worker, and you can also have, in some ways it could, that could transition to a foreign-born worker. So just knowing that there is some distinctions and overlap in these categories is what I'm trying to say, and hopefully I'm not confusing you too much. Labor force participation can include seasonal labor, marginal employment as well. And this is a point that I want to pause on for a second, because we do see that foreign-born workers have higher labor force participation. The way that labor force participation is defined by the U.S. Labor Bureau includes even periods of unemployment. So I think that there are some questions about the way that labor force participation is defined. And I think also that in relation to that, if you are an immigrant worker, or maybe a foreign-born worker that's working like on a visa or something like that, you may be more in flux. You may have more periods of unemployment, and then you find a job, and then you have that for a year, and then you're unemployed, and then maybe you start school, and then you have to go back home, and then you come back a year later and finish your class. Like, there may be a lot of labor force activity going on because of your status, right, as an immigrant or as a foreign-born worker on a particular visa. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that you are having a productive experience in the labor force. It just means that there may just be more activity among this population of people, if that makes sense. Hispanic workers make up the majority of foreign-born workers, and Hispanic is defined as individuals coming from a Spanish-speaking country. So Latin or South America, Spain, right? Portugal, right? Like Latin or South America. And I think that is also an area of nuance, because when we start getting into Hispanic workers, which could be workers from Spain or South America, when we get into Asian workers, right, who could be from China, Japan, Vietnam, within these categories, you have some workers that have really stable jobs making high wages, and then some workers that are low wage working 3 part-time jobs. So you have that kind of range within these ethnic worker categories. Foreign-born Asian workers are the second largest group and are doing the best in the labor force overall. Foreign-born Asian workers are doing the best in the labor force. They tend to have the more stable, higher paying jobs. They face shorter and less periods of unemployment, jobs that tend to be, set at higher wages, just in every realm, right? Every box is like checked for some Asian workers, where they really are doing the best in the labor force, better than any other racial ethnic group in the US. And again, as I said before, these are mostly Chinese workers. When we look at Asian workers from like the Pacific Island area, then we start to see much lower wages and different types of work as well, like less administrative, technical, science work than you'd see for like Chinese workers or Japanese workers. And we see more like food service, retail, agriculture, right, for those Pacific Islander workers. So again, within these categories, there is a lot of variation. Foreign-born Black workers, which, could be Afro-descended folks coming from any place in the world, make up the lowest number of foreign-born workers. Why that is, I don't know. Maybe they are finding jobs less than other folks, are being hired for jobs less than other folks. I don't know. Maybe they're looking for types of jobs that aren't available. But these foreign-born Black workers that do end up finding work in the US are heavily concentrated in service occupations, but different ones than US-born Black workers. 17.6% for Black workers, 21.8% for foreign-born Black workers as far as like service work. This is oh yeah, I do have it listed here. So this is specifically referring to service occupations. Okay. So what we found when it comes to foreign-born Black workers is that they tend to often have higher paying positions, and in some cases, but I don't know that there's a lot of variation to note, because there's a significant amount that have lower wages as well, who are doing things like Lyft and Uber and things like that. But we do see disparities there. That is something I wanted to note. So in 2023, the median weekly earnings of foreign-born full-time wage and salary workers was $987. Okay. The median weekly earnings of a foreign-born full-time wage and salary worker was $987. It is $978 for the average Black worker, as I mentioned. Black workers and foreign-born Hispanic workers are the most similar workers of all groups. If we look at dominant occupation category and median weekly earnings, they are the most similar. And we're talking about foreign-born Hispanic workers, not native-born Hispanic workers. Okay. That's where Black workers are most similar to foreign-born Hispanic workers. So the lowest wage earners in the pool, generally, that is who Black workers are most comparable to. So again, just really emblematic of the state of Black labor in particular. And I want to give a shout out here to Professor Gus Wood, who teaches at the University of Illinois, who also gave a presentation at Parkland College for Black History Month on labor and on subproletarization. And basically that concept was, kind of what we've been talking about, how the Black worker in the United States is subproletariat, like the lowest of the lowest of the low wage, like lowest of the low position, lowest of the low prestige, and that there hasn't actually been much change over time. And so this is a graphic that I pulled. There's a really wonderful book by W.E.B. Du Bois called Data Portraits, Visualizing Black America, the Color Line at the Turn of the 20th Century. I didn't put the book, I didn't list the book in the references because I got this from a different webpage that I did list in the references, but this book is really great to check out in general, because Du Bois goes over, like the whole book is like these images, these graphics, data visualizations that are attempting to tell a story about occupational employment of Black and white folks in Georgia in 1900. Okay, so check that out if you have it. It's a short little book. Du Bois has so many things. Du Bois is so incredible. I keep discovering new things about Du Bois, who was a sociologist first, let me tell you, but with so many other things. I mean, sci-fi writer, just like I keep discovering new things about Du Bois, and I've been teaching sociology for almost 20 years. Anyway, so this is Du Bois's work. And as we can see, this is from 1900, 1900. So think about the social context of that time period as well, right? Like right off the heels of slavery, still going on in some parts of the country and world, but extreme oppression of Africans in the US during this time period. So occupations of Negroes and whites in Georgia, we have 88% employed in agriculture, fisheries, and mining, and what also looks like 88% employed in domestic and personal service. For whites, you see 64% in the agricultural, fisheries, mining, and then I can't even read that number, but we see how small it is compared to the yellow here. Not a lot of domestic work and personal service work. And this is really reflective of the data that we just covered, y'all, as far as the current occupations of most Black workers in the United States. It's still here for the most part. Okay. All right, so in conclusion, thanks for sticking with me all this time. This is a photo of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Maids. Don't forget the maids part. Don't forget about the women laborers. People always forget the maids, sleeping car porters and maids. Okay. The first Black labor union in the US has an incredible history that should be explored. And I also want to state, that we should keep in mind the unpaid labor of Black women and how that's facilitated the work of other folks, right? Of other members of the family and the community in general, the unpaid labor, the caretaking and maintenance that Black women are constantly engaging in should not be overlooked. So these are my references that you can check out. Okay. So this was the labor statistics. I think this was the US Labor Statistics Bureau. And this is a book that goes over Marxism, Leninism. And then we have the Century of Occupational Changes. That's another labor document. We have the profile of 2023 federal workforce listed here. This was an AmericanProgress.org article. This was the Pew Research Center survey. And then we have the Brookins article here. All right. So if you have, again, questions, inquiries, you can reach out to me. You can DM me on social media or email me here at my Gmail address. Thank y'all so much. Hopefully, there'll be more to come. And if you have any specific requests about content that you think I can provide, let me know and we'll see what we could do. Take care and peace.